Hey everybody, Mr. Musak back here again. Today we'll be looking at imperialism in Asia and Africa. We've been analyzing imperialism starting last week with what it was and some examples of it. Now we're looking at some specific examples of imperialism that happened during the age of imperialism in Asia and Africa from the late 19th to early 20th century. Before we get too far, let's review the motivations, why this stuff took place. And a big part of it came down to raw materials and markets. So raw materials being stuff that is brought in from colonies to the mother country, markets being placed to sell that stuff. And when we analyzed the documents last week, Thursday and Friday, we saw those in through the charts that were there. The idea of power and prestige. Does bigger really equal better? Countries want to have more land, more power, that power struggle between two different groups. Look at those two documents with the English writer and the German writer, how basically said we need colonies to become more powerful and better. The idea of social Darwinism. Remember, the struggle between nations, the fittest wins. Going back to Darwin's idea of survival of the fittest. Here it's kind of like, how are we better? Kind of fits in that power issue again. Also fits into who are we better than? Are we better than the people that live in these countries and these areas, so on and so forth. And lastly, we read The White Man's Bird by Rudyard Kipling. The idea out there was that at the time, saying, people of different areas are not as good as Europeans because they don't have the same technology, the same beliefs, same religion, and so maybe they need help, and so we're going to help them as part of it too. And so all the motivations that take place. Now, one of the things we see as these areas are ruled by European countries is the idea of direct versus indirect rule, and we see it happen in different areas. So, indirect rule happens a lot in Africa, especially. Great Britain does it too in Burma, and India. Great Britain does as well later on, which we'll see in our case studies in class. But basically, we see the local leaders of the indigenous people replaced by white rulers. You have governors or viceroys assigned to rule those areas. And essentially, it changes the whole way those areas run. The laws are now European rules. They're done in a European language. It goes from being the traditional language of that area to now English or French or German or whatever being the new language of government. So it changes a lot when direct rule happens, when the actual rulers in charge are the leaders from Europe. Indirect rule is a little bit different. Here's where the European country cooperates with native local rulers. Basically, local rulers are there, they keep authority, but the local rulers have signed a treaty or signed documents that then kind of make them kind of report back to the European country. And so it's kind of a way of ruling through the local rulers that are already there. The Dutch do this in the East Indies, off the coast of India, where they kind of rule through people that are already there, and makes it basically gives Europeans more access to resources without actually having to put a lot of people there. Britain, France, etc. had no problems putting direct rule in charge in late 19th century, early 20th century. And so we're going to see some examples. We'll start with Asia. So first off, you can kind of see where imperialism takes place here in Asia. This is Asia 1914. You can see Britain here rules Burma and India. And you look at the motivations. A lot of the power thing was trying to keep this area here, Burma, because they want to try and keep France out of here really a lot of times. So right here you have France here in green. They rule Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia today, and they're trying to move in on the British stuff. So you see that power struggles there as well. All the trade. What's really interesting is Siam here, Thailand, keeps their freedom based by westernizing. If you heard the musical The King and I, is basically kind of where this comes from, where the king of Siam or modern Thailand basically westernizes and becomes more western so that they stay free versus being taken over by Britain or France. You see U.S. over here is rules in the Philippines, and down here is the Dutch East Indies, kind of being ruled by the Netherlands. And so all these things play a big role in here in terms of kind of colonialism in Asia at the time. I want to show you two examples here, kind of show you how some of the stuff worked out. For example, the Dutch, and they had their own East India Company, kind of like Britain did, same deal, and ruled over, basically Indonesia, Java, New Guinea, Borneo, these islands down here in this area right down here. And the reason they went there were for the resources. It was a very humid tropical area. Basically, you can grow things there you can't grow in Europe. And so the big things were coffee, tea, rubber, cocoa, essentially non-indigenous crops. A lot of them they're cash crops, crops that are being grown in the land there to be shipped back to Europe and sold for more money. And as I said, a lot of stuff here, coffee, tea, cocoa, they're not even indigenous to the East Indies, but they're brought there by Europeans to grow them and ship them back to Europe. In fact, you ever hear of coffee being called Java? It's because the Dutch grew coffee on Java, and that's kind of why it happens that way. What they did is something called a cultivation system. It's kind of like a feudalism in a way, if you will. Essentially, it's kind of part of the indirect rule, where essentially Indonesians were required to give a certain amount of product to the Dutch government every year. Essentially, about 20% of the land, 60 days of work a year went per person went to the government, and they had to gross up the government and give it to the Dutch. And so the goods they were paid for were basically got paid in copper coins that were worthless. And so people really kind of got taken advantage of in terms of trying to grow all these cash crops, whether it be coffee, the tea, sugar, etc., and give them to the Dutch to go back to Europe. And the Dutch were great middlemen, and they developed a lot of the infrastructure in Indonesia, ports, roads, all those kind of things to help make sure stuff gets back to Europe. I mean, the impact was big. I mean, yeah, you got the infrastructure coming in, kind of more modernized, if you will, but huge poverty among the native population. I mean, the white people, the Dutch are living there. The white Dutch are living there. Got really rich out of stuff, but at the same time, famine was very common. All the land is being used for cash crops, not used for food crops. And so when a famine takes place or disease hits the food, people go hungry, and it causes a lot of problems that way. Um, and so it does cause problems in terms of that in 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 uh in Indonesia, which is the Dutch East Indies. India's a little different too. I mean, when India took control, we were talking about this in class. They had a civil service, basically where people were trained in Britain. Now, some people that were trained in Britain to rule over British India were British. So back here we had kind of indirect rule. Here we have direct rule. And I said, for the people that worked there, they achieved a lot of wealth if you were in the civil service. Some Indian people who went back to Britain, got educated, could make a lot of money, but a lot of them did not. Most of them were poor farmers, poor people working for different companies in Britain. But it really was a good chance for younger sons and lower ranking people to get a good job in India. And you kind of see they can do stuff like hunt tigers, that kind of thing. We'll analyze some pictures in class of this too. The big problem for India was that the impact on India was huge. It costs a lot of money to run that administration, so you got to find it from somewhere. And so a lot of taxes got put on the Indian people. They taxed railways, so when you rode the train, you had to pay a tax on it. If an Indian person took out loans, they had to pay tax on the loan, the debt they took out. There were taxes for civil military services. All these things got taxed up on Indian people to pay for the administration that was happening in India. They had put goods on taxes on goods like salt and other things that were essential for living. Essentially, you took this great industrial country that was India, and you kind of tore it apart because you really exploited for terms of wealth. Essentially, we see all these land being used for cash crops, whether it be the rice or the wheat or the cotton or whatever heading back to Britain. You had a lot of man-made famines where lack of food because food is being sent back to Britain, and makes life very, very difficult. And you have work camps where 94% of people die because they're working on these camps to make the food for send back to Britain. And here's some examples you kind of see. Here are the great tea fields of India here. Kind of land used for tea fields. Here's one of the tea houses where they have all the tea piled up to dry out back to Britain. And here you have Indian people that are starving during this famine because land is being used for tea versus used for rice or stuff that can be used for people living in India. And we'll read a little bit about the Great Famine in class here on Tuesday. So you have that. Africa is a different matter. Okay, Africa is a different matter. We saw all these different countries here pulling for Africa. Basically, they call it a scramble for Africa in the late 1800s. Everyone wants to get a part of it. Everyone wants to be part of what they want. So here we have all different places. We have Germany and Great Britain, Dutch farmers called Afrikaners, Italy, Portugal, Spain, France, Belgium. Everybody is trying to get part of Africa because they want the resources there. And so the question is, do we fight a war over it? What do we do? Eventually, they sit down in Berlin in 1884 and 1885 with Otto von Bismarck, the Prime Minister of Prussia, now Germany. They basically map out who's going to take what in Africa. They said we claim certain land. We kind of say what we claimed, how they claimed it, and they basically take and carve Africa up. Funny part is that there is not a single person from Africa at this conference. So these white guys over in Europe decided what Africa is going to be, how the border is going to look, without asking a single African person. And we'll see what kind of issue that leads to a little later on. We see where everyone was here. You kind of see West Africa here was first settled by the British here in Nigeria over here. Basically, it's called the Gold Coast. A lot of gold came through here. France moves in later on, takes over a lot of this area. France takes over a lot of it. A lot of trade here, a lot of goods, a lot of gold, ivory, like diamonds, all those kind of things. North Africa between France, Britain, a big part here was the Suez Canal, which is located right here. And Britain kind of moved into Egypt, take that part over eventually. They also fought to control the Sudan, which is right here, and fought wars to control that. Down here in Central Africa, and basically was the tropical areas of Africa. This guy named David Livingstone. He was originally a minister, kind of explorer guy who explored throughout Africa looking for places and technologies and kind of see what it all was. And basically, they thought he was gone. So Henry Stanley, he was a newspaper reporter, went and found him. And eventually, he has this famous line of he meets this guy who looks nothing like the native inhabitants of Africa. And he goes, Dr. Livingstone, I presume. And also it's Henry Stanley, who then said, hey, you know what we could do? We could follow the Congo River that runs right here, run it all the way back into Africa, and use this river to transport all his goods out of Africa. And basically, Belgium moves in eventually to take this area over. Over here we have East Africa, kind of ruled by Germany, and Britain's involved in here for a lot of trade going across the Indian Ocean. Britain fought a lot of wars with a group called the Zulu. They were native peoples led by a guy named Shaka, who fought wars trying to keep Britain out of here. And in the end, this British guy named Cecil Rhodes, who really wanted to try and connect Egypt up here with South Africa, really wanted to run a railway all the way down, with Germany kind of getting in the way. For this Cape to Cairo, the Cape of Good Hope down here to Cairo being a big railway, kind of put everything together for them. Really two examples here. First, we have Belgium, and here's Stanley right over here, who kind of like said, hey, we can find all this land here. And King Leopold II said his thing was going to be a humanizing mission. Go help Christianize people living in Africa. Basically, put that kind of that white man's burden thing, and basically take over a lot of land. And Henry Stanley would give people a lot of these treaties. Essentially, the treaty was you're signing over all your materials, all the minerals on your property when you sign this treaty. And essentially, Congo, this kind of big pink colony right in the middle here, that became essentially a personal colony just for King Leopold II of Belgium. And essentially, he exploited the native population. Basically, wanted to get rubber, diamonds, ivory out of that land, and he basically turned to forced labor, execution, torture. Essentially, the natives there had the native population. They had to bring a certain amount of each of those goods back, or else they got punished, whether it be through torture, be through having a hand cut off, kind of being whipped, or whatever it is. It was terrible that way. To these resources. Eventually, the crime there got exposed and published in the media by newspaper writers, and Leopold had to give the colony back. But in the time he owned Belgium in the 1800s, they think about half the Congolese population was wiped out through these actions that they performed in Belgium. South Africa, the same thing. Here's Cecil Rhodes, this big famous thing he wanted to rule from Egypt down to the Cape of Good Hope. And South Africa is a big deal because of the goods they had. Gold, diamonds, silver, all those kind of things. The problem is that decades earlier, a group of Dutch farmers called the Boers had settled there. They were Caucasian from Europe. They spoke a language called Afrikaans. It was kind of like Dutch in a way, and they lived there already. And so essentially they ended up fighting a war with Britain over these issues. And basically the Boer War is fought about 3 years, and the British take on this scorched earth campaign where essentially they make essentially a concentration camp for people, where they fight this long-term fight with the Boers in South Africa and eventually take it over. It's a really, really bad situation, and it's a huge deal. And Britain also fought wars with the Zulu, the Shona, the Ndebele, and they won through basically using superior weapons, machine guns, cavalry, those kind of things. They could beat back against other forces. Eventually in South Africa, we see the idea of apartheid come up, where after Britain takes over, you have this basically culture of black and white being separated, different rules and regulations. Here's a sign from a beach, kind of says, this area is for whites, this area is for the blacks that live there. And this process stood until the 1980s. And one of the first places that Mohandas Gandhi, who becomes famous for his work in India, tries to get rights is in South Africa, because he's riding a train and is forced to move. And so eventually he stands up for rights to kind of change the culture of South Africa as well. We look at the motivations, review those real quick. We look at who ruled where. They did direct, indirect rule today. These notes to do Wednesday. Please make sure you work on the case studies in class. We'll get India Monday, Tuesday. We'll get Africa on Wednesday with some examples of anti-imperialism stuff on